Welcome to Smolder, the Professionals Applied AI podcast. I'm your host, James Wagenheim, and today's guest is Richard Diekema, a staff engineer at IDEXX Laboratories. He joins us to share practical insight on how to make AI work for you and how to stay sharp with AI doing more to automate our lives. And if you like this conversation, please hit the like button, subscribe, or find us on Patreon. Without further ado, here is Richard Diekema. Well, first of all, thank you for taking the time to do this. And I've been really excited to talk to you for a long time. Thanks again for coming. And I think one of the first things I like to do is start with a little bit of background. So I would love for you to tell me kind of how you found your way into software development, and also particularly designing infrastructure for one of the most impactful veterinary companies in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of an accident, really. I had grown up like playing with computers and being really interested in electronics, but in high school gravitated more towards like foreign languages. I took Spanish for a couple of years in high school and college, and also dabbled in Italian and German, and was kind of interested at that time in like translation, just kind of being able to understand different languages. Growing up in Maine, you're not really exposed to a whole lot.
Yeah.
So, anything foreign, was kind of interesting.
So did you go to Mexico, Maine to learn Spanish?
Yeah.
or to, I don't know if there's
Naples.
Italy,
Naples for Italian.
There's Naples, that's right.
Italian. And then when I went to college, it was, like I said, just kind of languages, mostly liberal studies. I didn't really do anything technology-wise. That was more of a hobby. And that was kind of the attitude that I had towards it was, as a kid, you're like, oh, I don't want to do what's fun as a job. I want to have a job, and then I want to have things that are fun.
Totally.
So I kind of had that mental wall there. And then I needed money. So I think when I moved out on my own, I had $100 in my checking account at 18. And so I ran out of money. I needed to get a job. So I started at a company in Scarborough, a payments company. And, they were doing this was in 2007. So it was still all like countertop devices. Card swipe machines.
It's like not cashless. What's the name of that company?
CashStar?
CashStar. Yeah.
No, this was at
CashStar?
No, this was it was called Nationwide Payment Solutions at the time. And in that, the credit card world, call them independent sales organizations. So it's like the company that programs the terminals for their customers, deploys them, and supports those customers with an affiliate bank relationship. So got a job in the shipping department at this company, and was literally just like boxing stuff up for a little bit more than minimum wage. And had done a little bit of programming the terminals. And then as I learned more about them, I kind of figured out how they worked inside, what the connections on them, they were all serial RS-232 devices that you would program. You'd use software to move software onto them. Mm-hmm. And I figured out pretty quickly, they were kind of dumb devices, and you could do more in terms of programming them. So figured out how to program 4 at a time.
Saving time.
So I was kind of honing in on the process and the workflow and being like, we could do this faster. At the same time, at home as a hobby, I was learning Linux because I was living on my own. It was the first time I ever had broadband internet. And so I was able to download Linux ISOs. And so that's what I did in my free time at home was, just play with Linux.
Like any good millennial does.
Right. I think I had my laptop, which was an old HP, with Linux on it at work one day. And the manager of the IT department there was like, Linux? Mm-hmm. I was like, yeah, I've been dabbling with it. He's like, basically, we're going to build a payment system, a payment gateway. And, it's going to be very specific to municipal organizations and have to host it here. So we need somebody who can build servers and knows Linux. And so that kind of started the ball rolling on getting into Linux systems administration and having a job that was working with computers, not just using them, but actually building stuff with them.
It's interesting. I had a very similar trajectory in that I feel like you and I both have an engineering mind. And then as soon as you see a problem that's probably just annoying, you start thinking of what are the different ways I can use automation to make this easier, more interesting, because it's so boring.
And just it's out of boredom. Oftentimes it's where you're motivated to find something to like make it faster. And so like
Right.
solving that problem is then more interesting than the job
Absolutely.
itself. Yeah.
Yeah, that can be an Achilles heel too.
Right. Yeah.
For those
Yeah,
types of
so-
jobs. They're like, focus on your job.
Yeah, I never really did well in those jobs. And then, so I spent 7 years at that company. And over those 7 years, I went really deep in Linux security because PCI-DSS was brand new at that time. So having to learn Linux security in a PCI environment,
Describe what PCI-DSS is.
they're the standards set by the card brands for information handling and information security. So it's like a bare minimum. In a lot of cases, practices like encrypting data at rest, password policies, who has access to certain types of data, are you logging, etc. So a lot of the regulations at that time were around just if something happened, can we trace it?
Right.
Because you're going to hold the bag in terms of liability when they investigate. And any breach at that time was kind of like a manual investigation process.
Yeah. That was the big
go to the
standard
merchant
for compliance back then, for transactions.
Yep. Yeah, which before that, it was like, they had encryption on like PIN debit keys that were programmed into the devices, but everything else was just like HTTPS. Yeah, so it was very loose, and then PCI came along and it changed a lot of things for how companies operate, but it raised the bar if you wanted to build any software systems that handle payment information.
Right. Yeah, I do remember a period where, companies were in a scramble to be compliant, and they were in a scramble for talented people that could understand the complexity involved of actually getting to the point where they're compliant. I could see them hoovering up anyone that's pretty intelligent, and obviously you would be in that category.
Yeah, and so much of it at that time was not, like PCI would set a standard and then leave it up to individuals, companies to interpret and implement. So that it's not like there was a recipe book, right, that you could reach for to be PCI compliant. It was very much understand the system, understand the security and threat model, implement with the tools that you have available, and then you would go through an audit process.
Yeah.
And that was annual. And then they would check your systems, essentially validate. So it very much favored people that were self-starters, could self-teach, because there weren't necessarily courses available. Especially in the Linux world, in 2007, like there weren't like YouTubers, or Linux security influencers. There were a handful of people across the internet that would publish things, articles, blogs that you would read, and then you would take that knowledge and then go apply it to your systems. Like, how do you set up IP tables to build a firewall for your system? There were other open source projects like pfSense, where it's like, if you need to build a firewall, an actual firewall device for the network, you can use pfSense. And that had like a more user-friendly interface, but you still had to understand, quite a bit to configure it and then make it auditable for PCI.
Right. And not just a complete mess.
Right. Or Swiss cheese. Yeah.
So that's sort of what got you started professionally in tech. Sounds a lot like what motivated you was pure interest. And that's really awesome. And so eventually you made the leap to actual software development.
Yeah. So after a few years of cybersecurity, because it was kind of a new industry, right? The term, like cybersecurity professional had not been invented yet. There weren't school or university programs for it, at least not locally.
It was just a function of IT, more or less.
Correct. An extension. Yeah.
Right.
After a while, it kind of became clear, like, oh, this is an arms race. It's always going to be, some number of external parties against you.
Yeah.
Or your, group of cybersecurity professionals. And, I kind of realized, like, oh, it's an arms race, and I only have to be wrong once,
right?
For something bad to happen. So I didn't really necessarily want that level of responsibility, because in companies that don't react or respond appropriately to threats, you kind of end up being an insurance salesman, where it's like something bad could happen. So we need to do this. And at that time, it was, you're kind of like running around like Chicken Little, being like, all these bad things could happen. And eventually you kind of, it's stressful. You kind of run out of steam and passion for like trying to force people to not use password 123 everywhere, because you're also doing like end user security, not just system-wide security in smaller companies. And so, it kind of became a little bit tiring and boring. at that point. Because if
could
nothing bad happens, it's kind of boring.
I could see the white hat version of hacking being pretty enjoyable or challenging, but I too find that aspect of security and IT pretty daunting and dull and not very rewarding, because you're just pretty much responsible when everything goes wrong, but the people that you're responsible for protecting are not helping you in any way.
Right. Yeah. And I did, I had to do like internal pen tests, and it was fun to find defects, like if we had a web portal front end, doing a cross-site scripting demo where I think it was cornify.js. If you found a cross-site scripting vulnerability, it would just plaster sparkly rainbow unicorns all over the page. And then you'd have to say, like, it's unicorns right now, but it could be, some nefarious actor in the future. So we need to fix this. Yeah. And like that part was fun because it was reverse engineering.
Right.
You're kind of looking at a system and trying to pick it apart, and that's what tickles my brain.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what was your actual switch?
I started writing software while doing security.
Okay.
So there were tools things that we needed to do for compliance that there wasn't necessarily off-the-shelf software, or it was prohibitively expensive.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'd been learning Java for a little bit. I had a coworker who was a mentor and was able to steal as much knowledge from him as I could and learn the fundamentals of Java. I had done like PHP before that for automation scripts and systems administration and some light UI stuff, web-based UIs. And then I started to get more into the web programming side. So that was like more systems programming. I think I built like a card data scanning tool.
Cool.
So it would go through any type of file, doc, PDF, text, and look for bin ranges, which are the prefixes for credit card numbers. So that anything that was just a bunch of numbers didn't trigger an alert, but something that matched a known bin range would. And that was part of our PCI process. But then solve that problem. And the next thing was like, well, what are these guys over here doing? And those were the guys building the payment gateway and the payment system. And so I started to pick their brains and see what they were doing. And so I just started taking small developer tickets off the queue and had enough front-end knowledge to really work full stack. Back-end was Spring Framework at the time, so I started to learn Spring. And then I started to take on larger and larger tasks and features. And as I started to learn more about Spring, got more responsibility. I was working with Postgres database as an administrator, but now is actually writing and developing queries for it.
Yeah.
And then that just starts to like snowball. So you like go through those learning phases where it's like super steep and then you kind of plateau and then you hit the next curve.
It's amazing.
It was just a sponge.
It's amazing how many people got their earliest taste of software and web development using PHP, because it was just so simple to get started. And there are still huge applications running on PHP, but it's sort of a mess. It's like the messiest, it's one of the messiest languages and platforms you can deploy, but it really was a great enabler for getting people into software as the web became our dominant form of attention. That was true for me too with web development. Not so much software. I was doing software first, but yeah, it was a really cool tool. And then, so is Java still your bread and butter?
No. I mean, I have written in the last 5 years probably a decent amount of Java. Most recently, though, it was more for like data processing frameworks. So Flink being the primary one that I've worked on most recently.
What's Flink?
If you have like Kafka streams or Kinesis data streams, the business or application logic that you create to consume and act on those streams, you would use a framework like Flink to process large amounts of data in parallel and in real time. It has like some semantics that make like end-to-end processing data pipelines. You can make strong guarantees about this message has been processed once. Versus at least once
picked up. Yeah, it accidentally picked up multiple times. Yeah.
Yeah. And it can also do
like a
stateful
queuing system.
Well, internally it's a distributed framework, so it can also scale out pretty well. Really one of the big selling points of Flink at this point is that it's stateful. So you can define state functions or stateful functions. And hold essentially as much as your cluster nodes have disk. So you could have like a terabyte of data sitting on disk as state. And just reference that without a call out to a database. So I think Uber is one of the big contributors. So you think about use cases like rideshare, where you've got a lot of real-time data coming in, telemetry, but also requesting rides, completing rides. They use Flink to process that information in real time.
So you can have a massive state.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep. And you can have like state machines built into it and have complex behaviors as part of your pipeline.
That's pretty cool. So I want to pivot for a second. AI is obviously being pushed into development houses, sort of all across tech companies and even non-tech companies. And I'm curious, what has been your experience of AI showing up in its different forms in your personal professional environment?
I would say in the last year is where it's really like started to show up. Before that, it was more like, oh, that's interesting, or ChatGPT would do something new and it'd be like, oh, that's cute, right? But it hadn't really hit a point where you would reach for it as a tool to do your job like you would in IDE. Within the last year, though, there's been more of a push from the business to adopt AI-driven tools, really as like a force multiplier.
Yeah. Before you move on, I just had a quick comment. I find it interesting. This is a technology being pushed from the top versus, so much from the bottom up, which I think is often how technology gets introduced. Would you say that's true? I've seen that in a lot of companies. I don't know if it's true in your experience.
Yeah, I do think that there is some amount of top down. Where tools are at right now, one of the biggest challenges is context.
Yeah.
And how much the chat agent, etc., whatever tool you're using, can really focus on and work on at the same time.
Yeah.
And a lot of projects, especially if they've been around for a couple of years, there's a lot of code.
Yeah.
The front end, back end, etc. So when you hear about this AI tool that can write code and you turn it loose on your legacy code base and ask it to do something, the results are generally poor.
Yeah.
It's not going to be able to go in and kind of look across, okay, we've got this pattern implemented in 30 different classes, and we want to pull out or modify that behavior. If you go to it and ask it to do that across 30 classes, it would stumble. At some point, it would start to go off the rails, or it would try and pull in so much extra context from imports or libraries that
gets lost.
Yeah, it really does get lost.
Yeah.
From my perspective and how I have used it is usually on smaller focused tasks. I've got this one pain point and it's a good fit for an LLM to tackle.
And is this like de novo stuff?
Not familiar with de novo.
Oh, just like brand new from scratch kind of challenges, or is it actually?
Yeah, it would be something that normally I would put together like a Python script to munge some data or documents or JSON or whatever, right? Something that's kind of low skill but high complexity, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Just the scale of it makes it complex.
Yep.
So a good example of that is there were some API docs that were non-standard, so they weren't using OpenAPI spec. It was just like an HTML page that had been added onto and generated by the backend for many, many years. And if you try to write like a Python script in a day to pull all that in, make sense of it, and convert it or attempt to convert it to something like OpenAPI, you would never be able to get that done in a day.
Yeah.
Right, unless you're some super genius. But that kind of task is really well suited to an LLM.
Right.
Because you can chunk it down, go bit by bit. HTML is well structured.
Yep.
So the input is not just kind of free text or unstructured input, and you can iterate. And so you can just have it go step by step, chunk by chunk. And that's one good example where I've used AI, and it's been really beneficial. And that was all local. That was using local models too.
Totally.
So using Olama.
Oh, cool. That sounds like if I could come up with an example of where it would be really well applied, that sounds like a perfect one, because it's really low stakes. It's a big time saver in terms of automation. and it would be a huge pain in the ass to do without
for a human.
For a human,
Yeah.
it's a really good application there for sure. I'm also just curious. So, what does your current IDE sort of like look like, and how you like it to be set up, and does that include an AI agent tool or agents in the background or anything like that?
Yeah, so I'm still kind of figuring out what I like. So I've been like a JetBrains, IntelliJ, PyCharm user for a long time. Like it was one of the first IDEs that I used. So at least 15 years. And those key maps are hard to forget. So I tend to start, in those IDEs. I have not used their AI plugins though, because they've generally been kind of
not up to par.
Yeah. And I've used some third-party plugins. Continue was one of them, and that was because it allowed me to switch between a third-party provider and a local provider.
Yeah.
Because one of my big things is being able to have a workflow that still works locally when there's no internet.
Right.
So I always come back to Ollama and running models locally and checking to see if I can still get good results. So that's one set of tools that I use. The other is what our organization is providing us, and that's Cursor. And that's Cursor with a pretty high limit in terms of usage. And the last 6 months, it's basically been like, let us know if you hit the limit. And we just want to know how you hit the limit. You're not in trouble. It's more like, what's your use case? We want to understand how people are using it. And so I generally have both. So I'll have the same code base in Cursor and my JetBrains IDE and move back and forth. So I'll use the Cursor agent to kind of work through and, using plan mode and coding mode to develop a plan first, read through the plan, and then, switch to building mode, have it execute on the plan, and check that out. But what I miss from Cursor is a lot of the other features, just from a usability standpoint. Some of the navigation, decompilation when working in Java, and some of the other things that it's like, oh, we have a language server for that language, but it's not fully integrated,
right?
Because I think Cursor is based on
it's a
VS
one-off VS code. Yeah. Have you pulled in the key mappings from JetBrains?
I think I looked to see if it was possible, but I'm going to show my age a little bit here. I still use the classic key map.
Oh, okay.
Because I never learned
the new on
new.
that level.
Yeah, I never learned the new JetBrains key map either.
That's awesome. Well,
I might sound like a Luddite.
It's funny. So
the muscle memory there.
You mentioned using planning mode. That's a pretty new feature for Cursor, isn't it?
Yeah, to some extent. Prior to it having planning mode, you could, though, have like your chat or your conversation and say, don't make any changes.
Right.
Let's just come up with a plan by using like a rules or a specific agent instructions file. But yeah, having the mode now where you can just be like, no, this is just a planning session. Don't start going ham in the code base is kind of nice, because it does tend to get a little verbose and a little eager when making changes. So trying to rein that in a little bit. It's made it a lot easier.
It can turn into a maniac all of a sudden if you're not careful.
Absolutely.
Just go bananas.
Well, I mean, as a developer, sometimes you do that too, right? You jump in, you're like, oh, I need to refactor this thing. And then it's like, oh, well, this over here kind of sucks. This is broken. Maybe we can fix that too. And then you've got like 300 files in your PR.
Yeah. You start pulling hairs and you create your own hairball. That makes a ton of sense. So you have, do you have a preferred model that you use when you're using Cursor?
I do. I think I've gotten the best results with the Anthropic models.
Yeah. With Claude.
So I have the Claude. I also use the Claude desktop application.
Oh, they have an
conversation.
Desktop one?
Yeah, on Mac there's Claude Desktop, and you can plug that into. It can use MCP servers. It does quite a bit. At its core, it's a chat based agent, and so I'll sometimes use that for more like brainstorming, and then once I have an idea, then I'll jump into Cursor and then start the planning phase of like, okay, how do we actually implement this?
That's pretty cool. So do you use Opus or do you use Sonnet, or you switch back and forth?
It's a good question. I'd have to actually check.
I feel
I'm probably the worst guest to have on an AI podcast, because I really don't know.
Actually, I think that's really interesting, because I feel like I'm scared to not use Opus and Opus Max, even on like small things. And I'm curious. So it sounds like you're more comfortable letting Cursor's defaults figure out the best path for what the problem is that so you're not as much, picking between models for different tasks. And the reason I asked that is when ChatGPT launched 5, they kind of went the route of like, you don't need to worry about which model we're using. We're going to figure out which one's appropriate for this question, and then we're going to deploy it. And I think Cursor is sort of taking a similar route. And I don't know if I haven't looked at Claude's interface in a while. I do use Claude Code, but I feel like there's some real convenience there. It also is something that makes me a little tense. And I'm curious if you have a similar tension.
I mean, there are like some models that I went into Cursor and shut off completely. Mostly the OpenAI,
right?
The Grok, and the Google ones.
Yeah,
and that's more of a personal principle than any sort of technical.
Yeah. They do have really different personalities when it comes to solving problems. It seems like.
Yeah, I don't know that I think I tried Gemini 3. Is there
2.5 or
Google's,
is 3 out?
Maybe it was just 2.5. But I used that for a little bit, and I didn't necessarily love it. And I could probably tell you more about some of the open source models than the commercial ones.
That's really cool. So what open source models have you been engaging with? You mentioned Llama.
Yeah, so with Ollama, you can pull in, a lot of different models. So I think anything published on Hugging Face is available. And so like Quencoder, Mistral, the GPT OSS, I've pulled in and used the Llama 3.2, 3.1. I've played around with those running locally. And even some of the large, I forget if it's 120 billion parameter models. I have a Mac Studio.
You can pull those down. Gigs. You can pull those down and run them locally. It's amazing. So I haven't played with this that much, but basically you have Ollama's sort of like a terminal executor or whatever that you pull down a specific model and then you can use it. You can make calls to it. Is that how it works? Or
yeah, so it has a command line interface, but it also has now like a chat style interface.
Oh, an actual UI.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the way you use it with other local tools is it has a serve command. And so it basically listens on a local port and provides an OpenAPI chat compatible interface. So, anything that supports that configuration of endpoint, you can basically point it at Ollama, and if it's OpenAPI compatible, it'll just work. So that's where a lot of my exploration has been, is using like agentic frameworks and understanding like what the inputs and outputs are from the model on a lower level in my spare time. That's not on work time. Yeah.
Well, I mean, what's cool about that is it shows that continuum from the beginning, which is your hobbies sort of lead to opportunities for solving problems at work, which who knows where that stuff will lead. But, I do think that right now the mainstream is focused on these couple of companies that are producing models that are operating in sort of a narrow band. And there's a lot of innovation coming from the open source community through Hugging Face, et cetera, where we're probably going to see really different ways to interact with AI that are more compact, more private, et cetera. And I was curious if you have any sort of things that you've noticed while playing around with some of those that you're like, oh yeah, this is something that's going to be much more big than it is now.
I don't know.
Or is it just fascinating?
I think it's just fascinating. Years ago, I worked for a company, and it was in the financial industry. This was a contract when I was a contractor. And we had to build software to just essentially search, but finding people that run financial sanctions lists. I don't know if I've talked to you about this project before.
No, I've never heard this one.
But it was for anti-money laundering purposes. So if you're a financial institution, you have to know your customer and you can't move money for sanctioned individuals. It's kind of that in a nutshell.
Yeah.
One of the challenges with that, though, is the more customers you have and the more sanctioned entities you have to search for, you quickly run into a scale problem.
It's a real challenge.
Yeah, and you have to be able to parse the list, but then also, implement efficient search over it. And so I did a decent amount of work in just like, okay, what is a string? What is a name? What does this actually mean? Playing around with like phonetic encodings and other algorithms for turning a string of characters into something that was more easily searchable. And that's one of those applications where now working with LLMs, there's certain tasks that are like already solved, like really simple. So embeddings, like text embeddings, vectorizing a string.
Yeah.
That's something that they do really well.
Right.
And so then doing similarity search on a vector from an embedding is much easier, or at least much more efficient than doing a bunch of string comparison operations like on the actual string data.
Yeah.
So that's been, kind of something in the back of my mind, in terms of like things that are interesting. Things that I see coming out of it is like search getting better.
Yeah.
And that was kind of one of my first impressions when using ChatGPT is like, this is a better search.
Yeah.
And I think it comes down to it's much better at like pulling out semantic relationships.
Definitely.
So that you don't have to read the first 10 or 20 or 30 results on Google. It can kind of already do that and then summarize it for you and condense it.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the interesting use cases that I tried to explore too, was having a classifier that didn't really know anything about your data and just being able to see a little bit of a little string of data and contextualize it in a way that a human can, that in the past you'd have to train on a lot of different examples. And if you don't really have a ready-made list of data, this gets you started in a way that's pretty cool. So, it's sort of like you don't have to have, a perfect idea of what string you're looking for, and it can figure it out. It can find the relationships and come up with a good result.
Right. And even like once you have the embeddings, you can point any model at it, right?
Yeah.
It could be even a tiny model and say, what does this sentence contain? What is the subject? Tell me what's here. And it can just do that, right?
Yeah.
Whereas and it returns it in a human readable way. I think that's the other key piece. It's not just giving you a vector back or some data structure that you then have to interpret.
Yeah.
It's literally just like, here's a sentence, tell me what's in it. Right. And it will spit back something that's like, that's actually pretty close.
One of the things that I like to use it for is I make really bad notes, and I'd be like, tell me what the hell I was thinking. And then it does a surprisingly good job at interpreting what, because I'll have like 19 misspelled words because I'm driving while I'm trying to make a note about something I want to remember. And I'll just be like, what was I referring to? And what research was I trying to say that I was going to remember? Because I didn't hear it right when I originally wanted to note it. And then, so I misspelled it. And it is surprising how it can make sense of that noise that I can't even make sense of.
Right. Yeah, and it's almost, I think one of the other analogies is like it's like a really good compression algorithm.
Yeah.
And so it's taking approximations of language, words, etc., and compressing it down. So like even on a tiny model, you have a really dense representation of like words and language. It might be a limited vocabulary. It may not be able to like write code for you, but it does have quite a bit of information about like just human language.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really cool. And I imagine if you looked at the size of the data that they're being trained on versus the actual model, the models are probably way smaller than the training data. And so, like you said, it's a really efficient compression model and is able to come up with, all the edges of language, like understand all the relationships, which is really amazing. I remember hearing a long time ago that they really wouldn't be able to come up with grammar in this way. And clearly it's figured out grammar in a novel way so that it can reproduce it better than a lot of human beings are able to do it. We don't have great rules. The rules are basically for college professors, but the way that people actually write, is something completely different. And it really has a great way of interpreting that and representing it.
Yeah, if like 10 years ago you had said, hey, build me a system where it's just a text box.
Yeah.
The user can type anything into it, and you need to figure out what to do. It would have been like, that's impossible.
Yeah, exactly.
Can't be done.
Make a mystery box.
Yeah, unless you're Google, right, at that time.
Well, let's jump back again to talk a little bit about your process. I don't want to linger on this for too long, but just tell me a little bit about your current development process and where AI fits in and where it's not fitting in.
I think where it fits in really well is I tend to jump around between projects. I work over multiple squads as a staff engineer, and sometimes you just have to jump in and work in a code base that you may not have touched for a while. And so that could be, going from writing Go to writing TypeScript. That's not always an easy jump to make. And so it could be going from Go backend to TypeScript frontend in React.
Yeah.
And, worlds apart, right? So I will use the agent to essentially look at a chunk of code or, look at an issue or even a feature, really adding a new feature, and I'll have it take the first pass.
Yeah.
So it'll be like, hey, here's what I'm trying to accomplish. Here's what I don't want to do. Mm-hmm. And then I'll usually go through a couple of cycles just conversationally in the planning mode. Yeah. Because I don't see it as like I'm dictating. Right. I don't treat it like that. It's more of a question and answer or, kind of back and forth to narrow it down and get more specific about what I want.
Is it going too far to say collaboration?
No. Agent, whatever model, sometimes comes up with off the wall, or I don't want to say off the wall, but is thinking too broadly. So, you do have to, I feel like you have to steer it a little bit more than say if you were working with a junior developer, because it kind of knows everything about everything. For this one little ticket or, adding this UI element, I don't need the universe. I don't need you to understand the universe to do this, right? So, it's collaboration, but with somebody who's just always thinking big picture, and you rapidly need to figure out how to narrow that down to, no, this is what we're doing.
This is the focus.
This is the focus, yeah. And then, once I'm happy with its understanding, and I'm always looking at the little context circle in the bottom right-hand corner, telling me how much context has been burnt or consumed. If there's a bit of room left, then I'll move to the build phase, because then all of that back and forth conversational context is there. And then I'll just say, let's go and build it. But if it's been fairly long or there's been a lot of things pulled in for context, usually what I'll do is say, okay, summarize this into a plan and output that as a markdown file, something to reference later. Yeah. And then start a new session and pull in that, sort of condensed, summarized, focused description, and then start going from there.
One of the things that I've heard from other developers is that, or if it goes down a road that you don't really want to go down, sometimes it's best to just throw away that conversation and start a new one. You sort of know what to avoid for the next conversation, but it can sometimes be difficult to have them forget kind of stupid mistakes that it's made in the past or poor assumptions it's made. Have you found that to be true?
Yeah, absolutely. To the point where it's like, okay, we're gonna revert. We're gonna start over, clean slate.
Working with a bad scientist, we need wipe your memory.
It is starting to get a little bit better, and I don't know if it's a difference in what Cursor is using for prompts, or if it's the models themselves. But it does seem, in the last probably 2 weeks, the results have been better.
That's great.
To where I could even take a more complex kind of starting from scratch idea and get to a solution much, much faster.
I've always thought, and maybe they have a feature like this I haven't noticed, but I always thought it would be really cool if in managing the context you had some controls. In other words, you'd be like, pay attention to this, ignore this, dial this, focus up, dial this down. Just something quick where you can like really hone its focus. And, maybe it could interrupt and be like, you know what, I really need to expand my context a little bit. Should I go further? Something like that. But having a quick tool to be, you were saying dump the libraries that are not relevant, like, giving it some ability to not get distracted by superfluous things and save some of that context for relevant information. I don't think they have a feature for that yet, but I think that would be really helpful. And I think you're kind of doing that by creating the plan.
Yeah, but that's also kind of what memory is. So I was reading an article yesterday. Of course, there's companies that have already spun up to provide memory servers, memory banks as a feature for agents and LLMs. And so a memory kind of allows you to do that. So
now, is this basically, I actually haven't heard this, but is this basically an MCP server that just says, hey, I've got memory, come ask me questions?
Effectively, you end up with a tool call that is like, remember this, store this memory, delete this memory, etc.
It's like a range of functions.
Yep. And I actually, was it last night or the night before, after reading the article, I was like, well, how hard can it be to implement a memory server?
Right. It seems pretty easy.
And so I played around with PG Vector, which is a vectorizing extension for Postgres. And it allows you to do vector-based similarity search. And so I went to Claude Desktop and was like, hey, I got an idea. Let's whip up a memory MCP server that provides these functions, and had it, writing me a service in Go with PG Vector. And within like 2 hours, I had it working.
That's amazing.
And I was able to then plug that into Claude Desktop and say, hey, you have a memory MCP server now.
Yeah.
I need you to remember this specific fact.
Yeah.
And it stores it in the MCP. And then I can go in Postgres and actually see what memories are stored.
Yeah.
And then I think from there, like if you want to use that with Cursor and have it integrate with the workflow, you set up the MCP server in Cursor, and then it will, you have to give it instructions to say like consult the memory as a primary source versus reaching out to any other third parties or whatever.
Yeah. That's really cool. Well, again, I'm going to switch gears on you. There was a study that just came out about 4 months ago where they had some doctors that were trying to find polyps in colonoscopies. Basically, they started with just doing it, and they recorded their success rate of finding polyps. Then they had them use ChatGPT and an agent, and then they tested them again, and they showed that their detection rate fell from 28% down to 22% when AI wasn't on. So they actually had, what they call deskilling risk after engaging with AI. And so I'm curious, is there any sort of parallel that you could see happening in the software development space where developers start to lose the ability to identify important security issues or important areas that they need to pay attention to when doing development or code reviews? Do you see sort of, an effect that might happen in the software development space that is sort of similar to that deskilling?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you don't use it, you lose it is very apt. Like anything, any skill, if you don't practice it, your brain just starts to forget it. So I think that's absolutely a risk. So I actually, for that reason, or among other reasons, I went back to school last year. And it was because I kind of had a moment where it's like, well, how well do I know what I know? Because there are a lot of skills, just from computer science fundamentals that you don't exercise all the time.
Yeah.
And so wanting to like retrain on those skills, I'm in a computer science program at USM right now, doing the intro courses and data structures, algorithms, and all of that, because those are still the fundamentals that drive what we're doing, whether we use AI or not. So this is me on my soapbox. But
Yeah.
I think that if you don't exercise those critical thinking skills and understand what the LLM is giving you for solutions, you have no way to verify if it's correct.
Yeah.
So you can't tell if it's working if you don't know how it works.
100%. One of the analogies that I've always thought of when thinking about artificial intelligence was the introduction of GPS into navigation. And, it just amazes me how little I can navigate now that I've had the world of GPS in my life since, the early 2000s or whatever. And they've actually shown in research that it really diminishes your spatial memory, location, orientation, and landmark identification. I think there's a lot of good that comes from the capabilities you have with artificial intelligence. Can you sort of steelman the case for where it's good and also where it's bad?
So using your GPS analogy, I think one thing that GPS does is it frees up your attention to focus on driving. Mm-hmm. And I think the same can be true of software development with AI.
That's a really good analogy.
Is that when you're not just focused on, or if you're not wasting cycles or time and attention on boilerplate, just like kind of the
semicolons and finding where the hell
syntax, right? Syntax.
Syntax. It's a good point.
Especially moving between different languages, having to remember syntax, following style guides. A lot of the overhead that comes with building quality software, right? It's all good stuff, but it consumes time and attention, and that's time and attention that you don't put towards solving the problem or delivering value. So I do see, and I think it should be treated as more of a GPS.
Yeah,
it helps you find your way. It might help you find places that you wouldn't have found on your own,
right?
But it's not fully self-driving, right?
Yeah, and you got to decide where to go.
Yeah. But you also have to, you're the sole sort of decider in terms of, does this work?
Yeah.
Does it meet the standards? Does it solve the problem? Did it do something useful?
I mean, I think it is true that they're trying to make it more and more of a driver and less of the steering wheel or the GPS. But I think there's an element of what you're saying, which is you got to stay in the driver's seat. Even if you have automation where maybe some of the decisions are happening in an automated way, you're still driving. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, you're ultimately the final quality key. And as a professional, if you're committing and you're pushing those changes, with your GitHub user or whatever, it's your name, essentially. At some point, you won't necessarily be able to use the cop-out of like, I was using, Cursor, it was ChatGPT. Because early on when I started to use AI in my work, I did qualify things, and I will continue to do that, to basically say like, actually, I wrote this documentation with the help of ChatGPT, or I use as part of the documentation, I'll say this was the process. I used this model, and this is the artifacts that it created.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good practice, and I think about the early development of the internet where people were really just putting a lot of really amazing content out on the web, and they were also ripping off a lot of content from other parts of the web. And there was a movement to include attribution as part of your development of good content. I think that's something that's going to be really beneficial long term, is sort of exactly like you said, stamping it with models and assistance that you've had in creating it in a long-term sort of global effort to understand how we're going to arrive at the next phase of how we have learned about our environment. That'll include anything published. I think it even potentially gives future models context when they're understanding, the information that's embedded. So yeah, I think that's a smart practice. I think that would be, good if more people did that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is, on that point, we've fed a lot of the internet to these models. And now models are definitely putting content on the internet. Having that attribution or that indication of like, this was model generated content, I think would go a long way towards ensuring that you're getting quality or at least human inputs into your data set, and it doesn't just become this like circular loop of slop.
Yeah. I mean, I think your passion is, as far as I can remember, always been about good architecture, apart from just the fact that I think you have a really solid engineering mind. I've seen the way you build and repair your home as much as software. And, one of the things, sticking with our GPS analogy for a second, that always sort of strikes me when I'm using GPS is that it will just take you down some really nasty dirt road and get in the middle of the night where no cell phone service, and you're like totally stranded and like having to figure out your own way. And so my question, if you were to take this and apply it to AI, especially in a coding environment, what dirt roads do you feel like coding agents take us down, and what are the methods to avoid those?
I don't know that if you're experienced or if you're a senior, that you're getting led down too many dirt roads without knowing you're already on one.
Yeah.
I think the biggest risk is with junior, more junior people or people fresh out of school picking up these tools and being like, oh, I got something, this looks like code, right? They don't necessarily know that they're in a bad situation, right?
Right.
And I think that's more possible with those users just because the language that I use when I talk to a model is very specific. Mm-hmm. And it's informed, by years of experience about how to describe something or describe the outcome. I can already picture it.
Yeah.
And, kind of what I would like to see. And so that's the approach that I take, right? Is, well, I needed to do this, this, and this, and this. And this should be generally how things are structured. I'll use very specific technologies reference, in the conversation, just so that it's not like pulling in the kitchen sink.
Right.
Whereas somebody who may not be familiar with that problem domain or what tools are available will take the first solution.
Yeah.
Or whatever they're given for output, and maybe pick up some bad habits or use out-of-date tools or libraries, patterns, whatever it is. And I think that risk is always there because the input, the prompts, whatever, is kind of open to interpretation for the model, and you have to know enough to steer away from pitfalls or those dirt roads.
Not to lead into anything too dark, but what are the sort of worst implications of that happening at scale?
I guess it would be, like, say, for instance, with SQL injection, going back to our PHP days, right? Uh-huh. At one point, it was perfectly normal to have SQL query building in your PHP script. Yep. It was one script, and it did everything, right? It was handling the HTML. You were getting user inputs. You were using that to build queries and then firing it off to your database, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think about patterns like that, they work, they're functional, but they're kind of a ticking time bomb in terms of vulnerabilities.
Right.
So, unless you specifically ask for it, how much security is baked in to what you get back from the model? Yeah, I think that's a...
Is there any way to avoid that? Like, what's the right path to, on a sort of network-wide scale of people, going into software and developing new solutions? Folks like yourself, whenever you were entering software, how do you make sure that this tool is something that they can start paying attention to the right things? Is there a way to do that?
Well, I think there's two parts. You need mentors.
Yeah.
So you should always have a resource or identify resources that you can bounce things off of, just to get a second set of eyes to check your intuition, right? If you have good intuition and you kind of sort of gravitate towards the normal path or the good path anyway, you might be okay. But if you have a lot of questions or you're not really sure, having those mentor resources available is really important.
Yep.
But also getting really good at self-study,
right.
Teaching yourself. And that kind of comes back to if you don't use it, you lose it. Self-study is critical, especially in things like security, because it is frequently changing. It's never the same day to day. And so on that topic specifically, like, you need to make yourself aware of the resources that are out there. So
Yeah.
OWASP, organizations that publish blogs or talk about vulnerabilities or the security space in general, just know that you have to build awareness outside of just, does my code work?
Yeah, I was talking to Peter Haas last week, and he's a roboticist.
Yeah, I listened to that episode. Yeah, that's good.
He was talking about an entirely new form of injection hacking with, basically impersonating libraries or looking like you were a public library that was open source and having AI accidentally bring it into your application. And so that was a new one for me, but it just shows you that the arms race is constant. And without experience, it'd be really easy to mess something like that.
Right. Yeah, single character difference when you're pulling in a node or a Python package.
It does seem like there's a big responsibility on the part of coding agents people that are developing coding agents to be really thoughtful when training these models and giving them access to tools. So using things like whitelisting libraries and being really deliberate around like starting with some safe parameters and allowing people to expand it as they need it. Seems like a smart play, but I don't know if it seems really open right now, so almost anything can happen, which is a fun way of sort of getting back to the root of what PHP was doing for us. But also you can just see where this is going, and that there's going to be some real outages that are going to need to be, we're going to need some guardrails.
Yeah. I mean, I think things are moving too quickly in a lot of ways to really put guardrails in terms of of output just yet.
Yeah.
Because the more controls you put in place, then you're kind of narrowing the possibility of what people can do with a tool. But having worked in environments where, there were whitelisted and blacklisted packages, there was kind of like the blessed set of Java dependencies that you could pull in because they had gone through 7 layers of auditing, accountability, and sign-off.
Yeah.
Versus
terrible.
Yeah, it was awful. It's like, I need this XML
I don't even know why I suggested
parsing library, right?
Yeah.
And it was always kind of a nightmare.
Right.
So I think maybe the answer there is not so much that the models or the agents have guardrails, but that you have a third party that can check. There's lots of package, Dependabot, Snake, I forget how to pronounce their name, but they do a function, where they'll scan dependencies and look for vulnerabilities, and if they know a package is from a bad actor, right, it'll hopefully get flagged.
Yeah, the Dependabot does a good job. Okay, well, I just have a few more questions, and then I think we're almost at time. There was a little bit of research done that was showing just sort of the impact on writing and tried to understand how using GPT or not using ChatGPT for writing was impacting quality metrics. So they had a group of students write without any access to ChatGPT, and then they had another group of students write using ChatGPT, and then they had independent professionals go and read those essays. They knew nothing about how the essays were created. The ones that were using ChatGPT, it was very clear that there was a style that was consistent across them, and that the people actually said, hey, were these people sitting next to each other? Or they described them as soulless writing. And I thought that was really fascinating, because I do think the prose has gotten a lot better in these chat tools. I don't think this is a problem for coding. It might actually be a benefit that it sort of has a soulless way of writing code.
Yep.
But I'm curious if you had any experience with this type of phenomenon in the software world or even in your personal life.
Well, so one example from personal life. This semester I am taking a writing class. So
okay.
English 102, right?
Awesome.
Academic writing. And we had to go through a peer review process, and which involves like reading other people's papers and then providing a written letter back to them, kind of giving feedback, critiquing, things that they could use for revision.
Sure.
And this class has a rule of no AI.
Okay.
It's like an automatic fail.
Yeah.
Essentially, if you use it. And one of the peer reviews that I got back, I could almost immediately tell it was AI.
Yeah.
Right. That somebody had taken my paper, put it into this AI, and then spit back something.
Right.
And so, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, yeah, you can absolutely tell, right?
Yeah.
Because there isn't a voice, because we all have our own ways of speaking, and when we read somebody's words, we interpret them in our own way, and then we kind of respond in our own way. And that kind of was missing.
Yeah.
When it comes to programming, I think that's absolutely a great thing.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well.
Because
you kind of want it to be generic.
There's like consistency with standards, and style guides and all of that. But there's also, when you work with enough developers and you work with them long enough and you put yourself in, kind of in their head, you can see in their code what their worldview is. Kind of what their understanding is. Yeah. And so you can kind of map out like strengths and weaknesses, certain concepts some people are really strong in, others not so much. And then that comes through in the code that they write and the approaches that they take to solve problems.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of unique, sort of variation between developers, but that generally works against you when you're working collaboratively.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? You tend to reinforce when you're brainstorming and coming up with ideas and approaches to solve problems. You want more varied inputs to kind of choose, okay, what is the best way here? When it comes to the actual, coming up with abstractions and writing the code, you kind of want that to be more generic.
Yeah.
To have already done that averaging across those approaches.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's such a good point. I feel like we want, it's a really colorful place when you get in there with a lot of people and are developing together, and it causes all kinds of, frustration too with stylistic differences. And I think you kind of do, at least from the back end onward, want a sort of beige. Like it's really helpful to have consistency. And I wonder if you agree, the one area that seems like it would benefit from that voice is the user experience. And that has its limits as well, because you definitely want people to know how to use your software. But I think there is a lot of room for innovation in the user experience. And so that might be where the boundary is. I don't know if you agree or if there are other boundaries in the back end as well that are like that.
I mean, on the UX side, I think that there's two types of consistency, right? There's visual styling, right? There's general guidelines, like you don't use, red on white text, or blue on red text, like the early days of the internet, where you had 256 colors
and dancing Jesus. I love that one.
Yeah.
Lots of animated GIFs.
Right.
Or is it GIFs? I never know.
It's GIF.
Yeah, okay, good. I'm glad you're
I think the guy who made it said GIF, but it's GIF to me.
It's GIF.
I think in terms of design language or just general good design and readability practices, I think consistency is good. But when it comes to the functionality of the UI, I kind of think back to what is it, Twitter Bootstrap?
Yeah.
Where it was one part style, and then you'd have these component libraries that would use Bootstrap and create these ready-to-use components to then just drop into a web page. Yeah. And I feel like that era of internet, things looked better, but they didn't work better.
Yeah.
And so I think that you had visual consistency, but not usability consistency. Everybody would kind of do their own thing as far as how to accomplish certain tasks in a UI.
Agreed. I think they confused usability with design, or at least with theming, which are very different.
Yes. Where I think making the UX more generic would kind of hurt is for apps that are trying to provide a unique experience or a unique UI. So you think about the early days of Instagram, that was all, kind of brand new in terms of how it looked and operated. It was a very different app. It didn't feel like other apps. In a lot of ways.
Right.
Which I think helped users kind of get attached to it and grew pretty attached to a very specific stylistic choice.
Yeah.
Now that we have Instagram, an LLM could just spit it out.
Right. Yeah.
No problem, right?
Right.
But that initial sort of shift in what an app could be, because I feel like, what was that, 2011, 2010 era?
Sounds right. I'm going to go with that.
Yeah.
I'll just flash
Usability
it
on
on the
mobile
screen.
kind of was terrible. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you started to get more consistency in design and usability and, where users expected things to be. And it's got better, but it's not, even, today, like things aren't purely generic.
Yeah.
You can still get very different experiences. I think if we lost that sort of creative aspect of it,
Yeah.
maybe we wouldn't have certain apps built where they wouldn't capture your attention in quite the same way.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really solid point. I mean, it has the benefit of, maybe it serves the purpose that the old themed, Twitter bootstrap platforms offered, because you can just give it a style guideline and it's going to try and stick to that guideline, and everything new it creates, it's going to include accessibility. And, that was one of the major challenges, as if you built a bunch of content and you have to go back and retroactively make it accessible or, consistent with a style guide upgrade. That's all made so much easier with the introduction of AI and coding agents. But to really come up with something that changes the way that people use software, that's where I think human ingenuity is really valuable. So I 100% agree with the Instagram example. Well, I think I've taken more time than I told you I would. But I just wanted to say thank you, Rich. It's been an awesome conversation, and I really appreciate you joining the Smolder podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.